a lot of it, I think, also is that there's a very kind of like shallow narrative about what it is that keeps people in these areas down. And so it's kind of like, it's just all, well, it's racism or it's systemic racism, just these kind of terms that aren't specific. It's like, wait, what is actually happening here?
Right.
And so much of the problem is that like the kind of culture and family units have just been destroyed. Like they've been decimated. And then it's like you can pump money into like the public schools there, which we do. We spend a lot of money on public schools, and they're still crappy schools, and the results are still bad. And if you're not like, even back in and there's a lot of like Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, who are both like two black conservative, really brilliant thinkers. They both wrote a lot about this, how like in the 40s, even during, there was, segregation in the South, and there was like a whole bunch of horrible policies. But even back then, you could walk around Harlem with no threat of like violence or anything like that. And family units were together. I believe the black legitimacy rate was higher than the white legitimacy rate at the time. And there were a lot of policies that came in that really destroyed like the family unit.
Like what policies?
Well, the rise of the welfare state was a really big one. It kind of subsidized single parenthood, which is, people respond to incentives, even though it seems like that's an ugly thing to think. But if you pay people for having children out of wedlock, you do get more of it than you otherwise would have. And the other major one to me was the war on drugs, which I just think was absolutely devastating to these neighborhoods. It's, when, just like with prohibition of alcohol, where I think was still the highest homicide rate in American history was under prohibition of alcohol. And then once they legalized alcohol again, it drastically reduced in the next few years. The same thing with the prohibition of drugs. You create these black markets, you create a lot of like violent crime, and that's what's really destroying these neighborhoods, is like the violent gang culture, and it's all built and funded around drugs the black markets for which would not exist if we just called the whole thing off.
It's just calling the whole thing off is so scary politically. Because if you were a guy like Joe Biden that said, I'm going to legalize all drugs, people would fucking turn on you. They'd freak the fuck out.
Yeah, getting the political will up to do it is something. But I mean, you even see it even with this, we got like 100,000 ODs a year now. And so much of it is driven by the fact that people are getting fentanyl in shit that they don't even know that's not supposed to have fentanyl in it because it's in black markets. And Joe Biden is absolutely, I mean, it's hard to like hate him so much now because he's so old and senile. It's hard to even hold him responsible. But his career, he was like probably the worst person on this issue. Joe Biden, since the 80s, was pushing ramp-ups in the war on drugs. He challenged Ronald Reagan from the right, partnered up with Strom Thurmond, and was criticizing Reagan for being too soft on drugs. And then he was the one who authored the crime bill that Bill Clinton signed into law. Yeah. He's got a lot of death and destruction on his old hands.
Yeah, that crime bill. Oof. The whole just war on drugs thing is such a strange issue because logically everyone knows that when you legalize things, and certainly when you decriminalize things, you get a giant drop in violent crime, you get a giant drop in addiction. It's so counterintuitive, but people are so terrified because drugs have been so devastating. Because I think that if we did legalize all drugs, and it happened quickly, you're going to have more overdoses. You're going to have more deaths. You're going to have more addicts. You're just going to, because there's going to be more access.
Yeah, but
when does it balance out?
Well, I don't know. I think there will be more access for sure, but I think so many of the overdoses now are because people become addicted to pain pills or become addicted to heroin and get fentanyl in it, and you wouldn't have that if drugs were legal. So you would have stuff like, there's not a problem with people smoking cigarettes and finding out there was fentanyl in their cigarettes. You know what I mean? Because it's not, but there would be or there could be if it was on a black market and you were just getting it from some gang member, Yeah. So it would reduce, I think it would reduce overdoses in that sense. There's no question it's a trade-off. There's no good, perfect solution where there's not any costs. But the major benefit would be you would eliminate like the gang violence.
Yeah.
And already, even I think when they and I don't have this like numbers right at the top of my head, on the front of my head, but the weed trade from Mexico, that used to be the big thing, and I think that's all but gone now.
Not
because like
necessarily. It's not. Apparently, because there's so many states where marijuana is still illegal.
right.
Most of the illegal weed is actually being grown on state land by the cartels.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a guy named John Norris. He wrote a book called Hidden War, and he came on the podcast to discuss it. He actually was a game warden and, wanted to have a job like, checking fishing licenses and stuff, doing game warden stuff. And he detailed it in the book how they found this creek that had been diverted and dried up, and they were trying to they thought maybe a farmer had done this or something, some obstruction, and they traced it to this grow-op that was in the middle of the forest. And his unit became like a tactical unit because they were having gunfights with cartel members. Instead of it being like game warden, now it became like a DEA type situation,
Right.
where you're running into these public land grow-ops where these guys, they take this area and they level it and they grow weed there, and these guys were camping there, and they had guns, and it's wild shit, man. It's the whole book is incredible, and the stories.
That's very interesting.
So that's 90%, he was saying, of all the illegal marijuana that's being sold in America is coming out of these places. Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is why I think you just got to call the whole thing off at a certain point. It's been a failure. I mean, we've been doing it for, 40-something years?
Yeah.
Or something. I mean, it's like, or maybe more than that. Is it 50 years now?
Yeah, I think
Right?
it's 1970.
72 or something like that. It started,
50 plus years.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, okay, so we fought a war and the drugs won. And now it's time to, just like with the Taliban, it's time to accept.
They keep winning. Like, they're winning and they're killing us.
Yeah.
It's destroying our country. And it's not the legal ones, it's the illegal ones. And the reason why it's destroying it is because they're illegal. Yeah. So it's also propping up the cartels. It's like they just you could walk right over there. People walk over here, walk right over there, and you have literally one of the scariest results of drug prohibition right there, where you have insane crime and insane resources that the cartels have. They control the government, they control cities.
Yep.